Well, now that we've taken a look at some of the Japanese imperial ambitions prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, we will now be taking a focused look at the Japanese invasions of the Pacific and why it became one of the most successful military campaigns of the 20th century. Now, while their German allies were busy conquering most of mainland Europe, the Japanese were still wrapped up in the Second Sino-Japanese War, where you have this almost perpetual warfare against Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists, as well as the Marxists under Mao Zedong. The British port cities found themselves surrounded, and the Japanese would eventually start leading these militant incursions into French northern Indochina, what is today what we know as Southeast Asia. Now, eventually, Roosevelt is going to respond with several embargoes, including on scrap metal and other resources. And the Japanese have this plan hatched to cut off English supplies from the Burma Road. And of course, this is going to lead them into Southeast Asia. Now, the American fleet moved from San Diego to Hawaii as a means of having a forward operating base. Eventually, gasoline and aluminum were also embargoed to Japan. Now, Japan would they would inevitably capture much of Indochina, including most of southern Indochina in 1941, which led to a formal oil embargo. And there were other resources FDR cuts off as well, including iron, steel, various assets. Um, and this is important for a few reasons. Mainly, though, because the Japanese were highly reliant on foreign imports of resources. They really weren't suited for a total war. They really preferred limited warfare engagements to achieve local goals in the region. In fact, the war in China at this point was already extremely taxing. And as we can see, 80% of oil coming from the United States, meaning that if the United States cuts off this oil supply, if Japan is to win a militant engagement, it must be very, very fast. Now, the Japanese foreign policy was very opportunistic. Rather than any natural alliance with the Nazis, their non aggression pact with Hitler was mostly a practical one. Hitler's invasion of the USSR and the European preoccupation with the German invasions basically put Japan in a position to act unopposed in the region, as Hitler was seen as the bigger threat to their power. Now, the Japanese essentially had two plans of expansion that competed with one another. One was the Northern Plan, this idea of launching a ground invasion into Siberia to get their much needed resources. But their defeat at Khalkhin Gol by the Soviets really scared them from engaging with the USSR again. Now, the Southern Plan would eventually be what they go with. Now, basically, what they planned here was to form a sphere of influence in Southeastern Asia and in the Pacific. Of course, to do this, they would have to remove the Dutch from the East Indies, and they would have to remove the British from Malaysia, both of which were very poorly defended as their resources were directed to Europe against Hitler. Now, Japan would take this latter approach again, yet really blunders in planning out the Pearl Harbor assault. They falsely assumed that FDR would go to war to defend his European allies' colonial holdings, when really American foreign policy at this time had no such plan. Now, Isoroku Yamamoto eventually plans this surprise aerial assault on Pearl Harbor, but the moderate Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe strongly opposed it. Unfortunately for the moderates and the Japanese government, his replacement by Hideki Tojo ensured that it would go through. The whole note is known as the final U.S. diplomatic correspondence before the outbreak of war. Now, as the Japanese planned their assault on Pearl Harbor, they had a series of sophisticated planes that would go into warfare with them. However, one of the big errors that takes place is their targeting. Now, they end up targeting fleet and planes and, of course, airfields, but they really don't hit the oil yards and sub bases. This is seen as many as a mistake, especially since the USS Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise, our carriers, weren't even present in the bay at this time. Yet the Japanese proceeded anyway, even knowing this. Admiral Yamamoto headed the strike fleet, known as the Kido Butai, along with the 1st Air Fleet. The Japanese sent several carriers in the Kido Butai, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, and the Zuikaku. Now, as the planes took off, eventually Admiral Chuichi Nagumo sent the first wave under Fuchida Mitsuo to bombard the assigned positions. Now, some of the Japanese aerial commands were actually misunderstood, but the attack was fairly successful anyway. The radar on Opana Ridge detected Japanese planes, yet headquarters personnel were at breakfast. Now, the Japanese caused pretty significant damage at Wheeler Field, Kaneohe Bay, and at the Marine Corps Air Station, and eventually Pearl Harbor Bay itself was eventually violently bombed and strafed. The USS Oklahoma and the Arizona were totally sunk, and many, many American sailors and airmen died. Now, Fuchida ordered the signal very famously. He said "Tora, Tora, Tora" to be sent back to the carrier Akagi. This was essentially code that meant that the total surprise attack had been achieved. Now, it's worth noting that in hindsight, the unnecessary nature of this attack and the fact that the American carriers were not even present would ultimately come back to haunt Japan. After Pearl Harbor, it was clear that the only viable Allied strike force in the region was at least temporarily out of commission, which meant that Japan was free to conquer the Pacific as they pleased. Their targets included British Malaysia, including the fortress at Singapore, under the command of Robert Popham, head of the Far East Command. And the Malaysian ground forces under General Arthur Percival were completely unprepared for this war. Their men were inexperienced, and their weak, undersupplied forces were no match for the Japanese, who prepared, I believe it was 11 divisions to simultaneously strike many targets in one massive assault. Now, the invasions and victories over Thailand, Guam, other places as well, like Wake Island, Malaysia, the Dutch Indies, British holdings such as Hong Kong and Singapore, including Rangoon, meant that the Japanese had completely overrun the weak colonial forces in the area. The Philippines were eventually captured as well, actually, and the American General Douglas MacArthur was forced to flee. He vowed to return, but it would be quite a while, and by the time he did, the Japanese would have conquered the entirety of the Pacific realm. Now, it's worth noting as well that colonial troops that are under the command of the French and the English and the Dutch, they really have little incentive to fight the Japanese. Most of them really didn't enjoy their colonial rule under the Europeans, and with the exception of some strata of their population, they really did not find the motivation to fight off their new invaders, who some even saw as liberators. Now, a prominent Japanese figure in this period who's worth noting was General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who is often called the Tiger of Malaya. His mere 30,000 men managed to completely conquer Singapore in February of 1942. He managed to capture 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian Allied troops. It is actually the largest surrender of British-led troops in the history of its nation. And while it is not the aim of this video, it is worth noting that horrendous war crimes were attributed to the Japanese Empire in this period, and certain events at Alexandra Hospital and at Sukching were worth noting. Finding themselves emboldened by their victories, in January of 1942, the Japanese continued their invasions, with several forces landing at Sumatra, Borneo, and at Java. The Solomon Islands would soon follow. Now, at the Battle of the Java Sea, Takeo Takagi essentially faced off against the Dutch commander Karel Doorman. The combined Allied fleet was entirely destroyed. It was entirely routed. Numerous fleeing ships trapped and were sunk by the Japanese. The Netherlands, therefore, were permanently expelled from the Pacific. The Royal Air Force in the U.S. ended up having to flee all the way to Australia. The Japanese gained valuable oil and food resources from these victories. The city of Darwin, Australia, was bombed to prevent the Allies from interfering in the incursions into regions like Java and Timor. This caused catastrophic damage and terror, and there were even rumors of a possible invasion, which, of course, the Japanese had no intentions of. Now, this whole period, it should be noted that from 1941 to May of 1942, the Allied forces in the Pacific were completely paralyzed. The Battle of the Coral Sea finally managed to halt the Japanese from taking places like Port Moresby and Guinea, but the damage had been done. The Allies had essentially been locked out of the majority of the Pacific, with Australia and Guinea being some of the only safe havens remaining. Now, the fall of the American territory of the Philippines largely falls at the feet of one of the most overrated generals in American history, which of course is Douglas MacArthur. Now, he was essentially planned to execute Rainbow Plan 5 if hostilities with Japan emerged. This essentially entailed falling back to the Bataan Peninsula and doing limited raiding and defensive warfare, being within range of basic resources to defend a fairly niche territory, not to provoke an overly offensive or over-sophisticated combat plan against the Japanese. However, Mack was really more concerned with his plans to barricade off beaches based off of troops he suspected he would have by April of 1942. Now, the commander of air forces eventually asks MacArthur's chief of staff for permission to bomb Formosa, which we today, of course, call Taiwan. This was denied even after Washington had ordered Plan 5 to be enacted after Pearl Harbor, and after the Japanese had bombed several sites in the Philippines. And by the time MacArthur had approved the bombing over Taiwan, Japanese planes had already obliterated the U.S. forces stationed at Clark Field, and a handful of spared B 17s had to be sent back to Australia. Now, rather than withdrawing to the Bataan Peninsula as he was supposed to, MacArthur fights an offensive war on the beaches with no air cover whatsoever. The submarines and the naval forces under the control of Admiral Hart eventually departs from Manila Bay, essentially stranding American troops with no support whatsoever. Now, in keeping with their theory of a limited war, the Japanese understood that they needed to destroy the American will to fight with some sort of knockout blow before the US's massive industrial might had time to outpace the Japanese war machine. This would take the form of coordinated assaults against the Midway installation and against the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska. Now, the American carriers assumed to be near Hawaii, yet half of the Japanese planes were kept on carriers just in case American planes approached to attack the Kito Butai. Now, the Japanese fleet was eventually spotted, yet the first few waves of American planes were entirely destroyed. The base was bombed by the Japanese, but it was not neutralized by any means. Now, these early waves of American planes really failed to sack the Japanese fleet, yet they did manage to prevent Nagumo from launching serious strikes against the island. Eventually, American ships were seen to the northeast, but the question was whether these were carriers or surface auxiliary ships. There's this fog of war out at sea had occurred again at Coral Sea, where the Japanese had been stopped months before. Carriers were there, and closer than thought, at the Battle of Coral Sea. So, in this naval warfare, it's essentially a game of cat and mouse, trying to decide whether you should retain the planes on the ships to defend against American carriers, or whether you should take the time to send your planes to Midway to bomb the installation. Now, the Americans essentially turned the battle in their favor with a new development called the thatch weave, whereby fighters would maneuver in such a way that which they would defeat Zeros, attracting the high-altitude Zeros on guard protecting their dive bombers. This would essentially leave the Kido Butai with no aerial cover whatsoever, and massive dauntless bomber waves ignited fires and explosions on the Soryu, the Kaga, and the Akagi. Now, planes from the Hiryu did manage to ignite the Yorktown, but their losses were so intolerably high that this is essentially a Pyrrhic victory. Now, what eventually cripples the Japanese Navy essentially comes down to this final portion of the battle. Now, the pilots erroneously strike the Yorktown again rather than striking one of the healthy carriers, leaving the USS Hornet and the Enterprise entirely intact. Now, Nagumo essentially chases toward the ships despite carriers having no business in surface battles, and the US ships move east away from them. This is an intelligent move. Now, Hiryu was essentially ambushed by further American planes, and the lack of radar proved to be a huge problem for the Japanese. And of course, it was sunk after being hit multiple times. Now, the Japanese waterlines on the carriers were inoperable, and the planes fueled and armed for intended strikes at Midway served as kindling for the fires and explosions. This meant that the Americans were now in position to overpower Japanese naval forces and to cover land invasions of island hopping in the Pacific Islands. Now, being in a prime position to fight back against the Japanese following Midway, the Americans would eventually engage them again at the Battle of Savo Island, which unfortunately was a United States defeat in every sense of the word. Now, essentially, it was just an operation to stop the construction of the Japanese airstrip at Guadalcanal, to take Tulagi and the Solomons, known as Operation Watchtower. Meanwhile, the Japanese Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was to intercept this fleet and to leave the Marines on Guadalcanal stranded and surrounded. Now, they planned to hit the Guadalcanal fleet first and then the American ships off Tulagi. The U.S. carriers managed to not send any bombers, and the Japanese aerial reports considered significant damage in their raids over United States ships. Now, the nighttime movement of the Japanese fleet managed to slip past the American reconnaissance destroyer Blue. Now, MacArthur's planes eventually do deliver a report of Mikawa's ships, but very late to Admiral Turner. Now, eventually, Turner's order to search the slots, which is an area of sea around the islands, was not received by seaplane tender, and it was not performed. Also believing that the Japanese were building seaplane ports in northern Solomons, Mikawa squeezes through forward destroyer screen. Now, commanding Admiral Crutchley of Southern Group managed to be absent, and the Allied ships were therefore divided in groups to be beaten in detail. Now, Captain Boat eventually flees the battle, abandoning transports by Guadalcanal, and he did not inform the northern group of the Japanese fleet. And there were, of course, numerous theories as to why the communication was so poor on part of the Allies. Now, the northern group, not surprisingly, got pincered by the Japanese fleet, and there was massive confusion as to who was lighting them up and destroying them. Admiral Fletcher had pulled the carriers out of the region the day before, yet the Japanese do not attack the carriers and decide to play it safe and just rout the fleet. Although this turned out to be a disaster for the Allies, largely Mikawa's failure to destroy the Allied transport ships allows Guadalcanal offensive to survive. This is yet another example of a unfulfilling victory by the Japanese that is really buying time rather than achieving real strategic goals. While this is a temporary victory for the Japanese, it should be noted that the Americans would continue in their offensives, they would succeed at Guadalcanal, and would continue to have the Japanese on the back foot for the rest of the war, both in terms of air power, land power, and sea power.